welcome very briefly all of you here to the town of Irondequoit and to our town hall here, and thank our Majority Leader Joe Morelli for hosting this presentation here today. I want to recognize also another elected official in the room. We have Dave Seeley from the Irondequoit Town Board, who's here as well, so he's in the back of the room. And I just want to start off by thanking Joe for his leadership in advocating for upstate New York and for our region in particular. He's been a terrific partner to work with, not just here in Irondequoit, but for all our partners in government in Monroe County and upstate New York, in advocating for our region in the state and in the state budget. And so it's been great to partner with him. I welcome you here. Also, we're home to our brand new consolidated library next door, so if you have a moment, if you want to visit our library after this presentation, I know that would be welcomed. This was also done with great support from our friend Joe and for the support from the state, so you could check out that. So without further ado, Joe Morelli.
Good morning, and thanks so much for coming here. First, let me thank not only the town of Irondequoit, but the town supervisor, Adam Bello, who's doing such a wonderful job. It's a real joy to have local government officials that you work with who are as talented and as committed to the cause as Adam Bello is. So, Adam, thank you for that introduction and for being here and for letting us use this beautiful facility. And thank all of you for coming this morning. Let me just start by saying, if there's anyone who is has any hearing issues, is deaf or hard of hearing, I learned, Kat and I were talking about this morning, you can't say hearing impaired, which is a term they used to use. You can't use that anymore. So I'm learning, evolving. But if anyone is, please feel free to use these seats up front, and Kat will provide interpretation for us. So thanks so much for being here. I want to just give a relatively brief overview of what the governor has proposed in the budget. And then obviously the most important thing to me is to answer any questions or hear comments from people about what they think priorities are. And let me just start before I even go to the presentation, just give you sort of my observation about budgets, having now done this for a while and watched not only at the county level, or rather at the state level, but also at the county level, town level, that budgets are really a series of priorities. They obviously have dollars attached to them, but they really tend to give you a sense of what's valued by a particular government, valued by a community, valued by any organization. So you get a sense for looking at budgets of what the priorities are. I should also say that in New York, and this dates back to the early part of the 20th century, we have what's called an executive budget. Before the 1920s and Al Smith's governorship, budgets were really put together by appropriations agreed to by the legislature. And so you'd have a hodgepodge of different spending bills that the legislature would take up, and there was a great reform and rewrite of the Constitution, and we created what's called the executive budget. And under the executive budget, the governor of New York will submit to the legislature a proposal, for the most part, the legislature has the ability to do several different things to various items in the budget. We can reduce an appropriation that the governor might ask us to approve. We can eliminate it altogether, but we are not able to add money to an appropriation unless there's a separate and distinct line, which the governor then has the right to line item veto. So the governor has pretty extensive powers when it comes to budget making, not to mention once the budget is approved, the governor, because the budget office decides when checks will go out, has a great deal of control about how to pay bills for the state of New York. Over the last decade and a half, the power of the executive or the governor has grown even beyond what the original Constitution intended, but the Court of Appeals ruled under a series of lawsuits that involved Governor Pataki and the legislature at the time, really gave the governor even greater latitude to make changes in policy when it comes to the budget that may or may not be directly related to an appropriation. So the governor can actually change sections of law or propose changes in sections of law. The legislature may eliminate those sections, but we may not alter or change. That's given the governor even greater power in budget making. And finally, if all that wasn't enough, there was another, not so much change, but practice that was begun by governors, or at least the possibility of using this device was introduced by Governor Patterson. In the last year in David Patterson's governorship, he submitted a budget. The governor and the legislature couldn't come together on an agreement. April 1st, the beginning of our fiscal year, came and went, which in those days was sort of the practice. And the governor submitted an emergency spending bill to us, which lasted for about 2 weeks, which was the practice. Back then, we would continue the government by having a 2-week window of spending that essentially paid the payroll and some basic needs of the state. And at the end of those 2 weeks, if we hadn't agreed to a budget, we would do another 2-week budget and another 2-week budget, et cetera. And the interesting thing about emergency spending bills is the legislature may not alter them in any way. You either approve them or disapprove them. And so that went on for a period of weeks. In fact, it ended up resulting in the latest budget in the state's history. But what ended the stalemate and what's really changed all of this is in August, I believe it was, of that year, which would have been 2010, the governor decided, you know what, I'm not going to send up an emergency bill that's just 2 weeks of spending. I'm going to send up the entire rest of the year in an emergency bill. And the legislature will either agree or not agree. And it would either shut down the government or not shut down the government. And in doing that, he effectively, and the legislature and the governor came to an agreement, and the budget stalemate ended. But what it informed future governors is that on April 1st, if we don't have a budget agreed to, the governor will submit, and has threatened each year now, that's been the subtle threat, I'll give you an emergency spending bill on April 1st, the beginning of our fiscal year, which is the entire budget. And you won't be able to make any changes, so it's either yes or no. So the only reason I tell you all this is just because it gives a sense of how much leverage the governor has in budget negotiations. Now, this doesn't apply to any other bills that come before the legislature or that originate in the legislature and go to the governor, but it does apply to budgets. So there have been times over the last 4 or 5 years, I think, where the legislature would have had its druthers made different changes to a budget, but the governor simply wouldn't agree, and the governor essentially said, well, on April 1st, you'll get the budget either I originally wanted or some other variation of it, but you'll have no real ability to change that in any way. You'll either shut down the government or agree to what I've given you. So that's given the governor extraordinary powers. So what I'm going to talk about today is really a couple things. Highlights of what the governor has proposed, a little bit of insight, if I can, into what the discussion has been around the legislature on different pieces of the budget, and also then, as I said, take your comments and questions, which is really the most important. Hopefully I'll be able to manage the technology here. So one of the things, just in terms of context, give you a sense of where we were, where we've been over the last 5 years. This has really been a significant shift, both in the finances of the state, as well as sort of the practice of the budgeting. First of all, the last 5 years have resulted, for the first time in decades and decades, 5 straight on-time budgets. And in those budgets, interestingly enough, a couple of important things, one of which I'll talk about a little more in depth here, but is we haven't resorted to borrowing money. Now, we borrow money to pay for capital costs, roads and bridges, the way any organization would pay for capital expenditures by bonding, but we haven't resorted to borrowing money to pay ongoing operating costs, so that's important. Second, I'll talk a little bit about spending practices, but the 5 on-time budgets is a significant thing. In 2011, when Andrew Cuomo became governor, we faced a $10 billion deficit, which meant that if we continued the spending practices as they were written in law at the time and didn't change the tax law in any way, we would have ended the year with a $10 billion imbalance. And our budget right now is roughly $140 billion, a little north of that. I'll talk about that. It wasn't much lower than that in 2011, about $130 billion and change. So a $10 billion deficit on a $130 billion base is a significant deficit. And as I said, we were chronically late. Over the past 5 years, we're delivering better, more efficient results as it relates to budget. Some of the out-of-control inflators, which I'll talk about briefly, have been replaced with new measures that keep spending in check. And we've tried to reorganize the government to make it more effective in reducing debt and pension liability, which we have done as well. Medicaid, which when I first came to Albany grew routinely in high double digits, has now been replaced with a global budgeting program, and we have worked with various partners in the various sectors, private sector, not-for-profit sector, and public sector, to overhaul the Medicaid program. Now, that's not without substantial challenges, as some of my friends in the audience will note, who are involved in particular with caring for the elderly at skilled nursing facilities and assisted living facilities. So it has been challenging, but frankly, given the amount of dollars we were spending on Medicaid, something needed to be done to be able to try to make more sense. And hopefully in time we will get to a better delivery system. Economic development, probably most of you know that over the last 5 years we have developed a regional strategy around economic development. And I serve on the Finger Lakes Regional Economic Development Council, which identifies for people in our community, business leaders, academic leaders, labor leaders, community leaders, government leaders, come together and identify priorities that are transformative in terms of economic development projects. Part of this was also the Upstate Revitalization Initiative, which Rochester won. It was a competition between upstate regions. Rochester was one of the 3 selected to receive $500 million over the next 5 years, $100 million a year. It's predictable money. It's used for economic development projects, again, which we consider transformational. And I can talk about that a little bit if people have more interest in that. And our budget has gone away. We've actually now been able to end our years with modest surpluses. Part of that has been because we've had settlements with some large banks on significant amounts of money, which have allowed us to make infrastructure improvements. This year in particular, the governor has proposed a significant increase in infrastructure spending. And the reason we use that for infrastructure or capital costs is because it's non-recurring revenue, so you don't want to put it into education aid, for instance, because the money's essentially a one-time settlement with a number of banks. The governor talks about this a lot, and one of the reasons that he has created his budget system, in a sense, and constraints is because of this slide and the next one I'll show you, which is spending from 1962 to 2010, so roughly the time Nelson Rockefeller was governor, until the day David Patterson left office. Spending in the state of New York was annually increased at 6.8%. And you can see the growth of income in the state of New York by residents of the state during that period was, on an annual basis, 6.2%. Inflation was at 4.1%. Luckily, over the last several years, inflation is down dramatically. Some people would argue essentially we live in an era of no inflation whatsoever. It's very, very modest. But over that period of time, 4.1%. So you can see spending by the state of New York dramatically outpaced inflation and outpaced income growth by residents, and that is not a sustainable model, to say the least. Right now, we have in our annual budget, I'll talk a little bit. I said our budget's about $140 billion, and it is, but some of that money comes from other sources, the federal government, et cetera. I'll talk a little. I have a slide that shows that. However, if we had maintained spending growth at the rate of personal income growth, which is one of the indexes you use, or indices, our spending would be at $45 billion. And you can see that's a dramatic increase over that during that period of time. So during the last 5 years, our spending growth has actually been at 1.4% year over year. Dramatic change from the 6.8% that it had been for the previous 50 years. And Andrew Cuomo is insistent on this. One of the reasons this has forced us, as I said at the beginning, budgets are priorities. And a set of priorities. And when you know that spending is going to be roughly at the rate of inflation, even though other things may outpace the rate of inflation, it has really forced the legislature to establish with the governor priorities. In fact, I was with the governor the other day, and someone asked a question about increasing spending in a particular area. And the governor said, look, that's clearly something that's important. I won't tell you what it was because there's a million important things that people want to fund. He said that's very important. I don't disagree. And I have some money in here to do that, but obviously you would like more. The person who asked the question wanted more spending in a particular category. And the governor said, I don't object to it, but you're going to have to find ways of cutting things I've proposed in other areas because essentially once I give you the budget and propose it, it's a zero-sum game. You have to take from other places because I'm not going to increase spending beyond the global spending cap that I've put in place. And because of all the things I told you at the beginning and all the influence the governor has in budget making, that's a real thing for the legislature to pay attention to. So spending in 2015-16, and that's the fiscal year we're about to end on March 31st. By the way, our fiscal year runs from April 1st to March 31st. It's the earliest adoption and earliest fiscal year of any state in the nation by several months. So that's why New York is the first adopter of a state budget in the country. And I'll just say that the two lines can be at times confusing. The all funds, which is the bottom line in white, and you have this in your handouts, $143.6 billion. That's what we call all funds spending. That's if you took every dollar that comes to us through taxes of various kinds, but also from the federal government, because we participate in programs like Medicaid, which are federally and state funded and locally funded. But the line on top is simply the state spending, $94.3 billion, exclusive of federal dollars primarily. So as you can see, the all-fund spending proposal is to increase by $1.7 billion, or 1.2%. State spending, or the portion of that 145 proposed $billion, the 95.9, is the state portion. That's scheduled to go up under the plan by 1.7%. Clearly, both, again, less than 2%, which is what the governor always tries to keep it at. So these are essentially just, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I think it's actually identified in different ways in the package, and there's a couple of different illustrations of this. But spending by the state, as I said, is proposed to be $95.9 billion, and these are the large components that make up the spending. So Medicaid, which I mentioned, which is health care dollars for essentially indigent people, people without assets and resources and income. The significant portion of that are, frankly, people who are elderly, who are in long-term care, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and Medicaid is a significant portion of our budget. You can see that's almost $18 billion. That's just the state share. It doesn't include the federal or the local government participation. And that increased by $160 million, 1.4% increase. School aid, which is the single largest thing that we spend money, and when I say school aid here, I mean pre-K to 12th grade. It does not include the money we spend for the state or city universities or higher education. So this is simply what you'd call primary and secondary education. State operations, you can see this is actually the money the state spends on its own operations, our prison systems, our administrative overhead, people who work for the state of New York, the legislature, the judiciary, et cetera. And we have kept a pretty close watch on that, and you can see spending for that. As it is in most years, virtually flat. This year it actually is proposed to go down a little bit. So the governor has really forced state government to do more with less. And then all other spending is projected to go up by less than 1%. So the big driver in that really is school aid, and that's not atypical. That's usually what happens each year. So this is just a way of looking at it in a different way, but it gives you a little more detail. Medicaid and public health, $52 billion, because that's when you start to add in the federal money as well. So remember the previous slide was just the state contributions to Medicaid. This includes the federal government contributions. So $52 billion, and that does include some other public health programs. Education spending, $30.2 billion. Again, our operations are $20 billion. All other 11.6. Capital and debt service, because we have debt service on roads, bridges, buildings that we build, hospitals, et cetera. So we have capital expenses. And then you can see social services, $14.2 billion. And that's probably a little lower than most people think. People would probably think we spend more on sort of what's quote-unquote social services. STAR program, those of you who get a STAR benefit, which would be homeowners. Yes, sir. Yeah, those are just the things that we may take in or that we spend money on that are just New York activities that are not mandated by governments, that are outside of all these other categories, sort of the general thing that we just put in without giving that more detail. So it's exclusive of social services, healthcare. Could be corrections system, prisons, I beg your pardon? Parks, environmental services. You'll see that in here we have an environmental fund. So those are other things. I did note out the STAR program, which people get benefits. That actually sending those checks and giving those credits on our ledger is about $3.2 billion. And then there's higher education, 2.6. So if you actually look at education and higher education together, we spend almost $33 billion a year on education in New York State. The highest, by the way, of any state in the country, and certainly on K through 12 per student, we're by far and away the highest in the country. This is how we get the money. So the other pie chart was how we spend it. This is how the money comes in. Federal grants, largely, again, Medicaid, although there are dollars for schools and other things, but they tend to be relatively modest. $51 billion. Personal income tax accounts for almost $50 billion. Miscellaneous receipts, again, those could be fees, hunting, permits for fishing, although those might come under user taxes, actually, but gas taxes, et cetera. Consumption, user tax, and fees, $16 billion. Business taxes, $8 billion. And other fees and taxes, $3.5 billion. That's how we generate all that money. So this is sort of the highlights of where those spending priorities will be. Yes, sir.
If I want to see a breakdown how school aid breaks down payroll, benefits, maintenance, where would I go to see that?
Essentially, well, we do it a couple different ways. So the question is about school aid. How would you find more detail? What you essentially we have is something called school aid runs, and school aid runs will tell you in pretty good detail what the state of New York sends to each school district. So we give general school aid. We send dollars to school districts to reimburse them for transportation costs, so busing. We will send them reimbursement for BOCES costs that they have, BOCES aid, textbook aid. There's several capital costs and building aid. So what you would see is each school district, there's 700 school districts in the state of New York, each gets a run of how much money they will get from the state of New York by general aid and individual categories. Now, for you to actually know what they do with those state dollars, you'd have to go to the local district to find out how much of that money is salary, how much is capital costs, et cetera. Because we distribute the aid, but we don't pay the bills for the school districts. They obviously do that on their own.
Is there a composite for each county, the 62 counties of revenue and expenses, so I can look at the financial statement and see plus and minus?
The comptroller's office may compile aggregate spending by category by school districts because the comptroller does the auditing for the state of the various local governments, including school districts, does financial and management audits, and the comptroller's office may aggregate that data. I've not seen it done by county, I don't think, but obviously it's available. So we might be able to check and find out if there's a place where you can get that information. So let me talk a little bit about economic development. The governor's proposed nearly $1 billion, $900 million in appropriations for capital project investments throughout the state. They propose to reduce taxes for small businesses by $300 million. There's actually a talk additionally around even increasing small business tax cuts over the last couple of weeks as we have gone through this between the legislature and governor. And the governor's proposed $66 million to support efforts to promote New York State as a tourism destination. I will say tourism spending by the state of New York has gone up pretty dramatically in the last several years, and the governor has been a huge proponent of trying to encourage people to come to New York for tourism purposes. And actually, it's got a pretty good return on the money that we've invested because more and more people are coming to New York, and not just New York City and the metro region, but a lot of people are coming to upstate New York to make use of whether it's winter, although this year the snow, although we may not all mind that, but if you're a skier, this has not been great, but to promote upstate during the summer as well. The governor's proposed a downtown revitalization initiative, $100 million, divided up by the various regions. The regional economic development process continues to go forward, and the governor's asked for additional money for that. That's outside of the $500 million that I mentioned per the three regions that won the upstate revitalization, and he has proposed for various high-tech programs, $38 million, and including $13 million for Centers for Advanced Technology, of which we have at least one here. We actually may have one. There's a CAT at both RIT, I think, and U of R, and a combined $8.7 million for 10 Centers of Excellence, and we have one of those at RIT and one at U of R as well. Let me just briefly go through what the governor has proposed on schools. He's proposed increasing school aid by $991 million to $42.22 billion. That's for the school year, which is different than our fiscal year, which is why the numbers don't look the same. It's a 4.3% growth in school spending. Of that, and I won't get too much into the weeds unless you're an educator, there's two different pots of money for school aid that's developed over the last few years. One is called foundation aid, which is the basic foundation formula, and something is called gap elimination adjustment, which occurred several years ago when commitments were trying to be made to some of the school districts in the state that have a higher wealth ratio, so they're a little better off than foundation aid schools, and we made a commitment to pay them back for some aid that they weren't going to receive. So each year we have paid down that commitment, and there is another pay down of that of almost $190 million this year. And either this year or next year, that commitment will be fully funded, so this line won't exist much longer, either this year or next year will be the last year. The governor's proposed $100 million in community schools. These are schools that are on the failure list, for want of a better word, and these are schools largely in urban areas that have just not succeeded at any way, and the governor's proposed putting additional dollars for what they call wraparound services to help children in those neighborhoods have better instruction during the summer, after-school programs, and other kinds of services which would help their educational attainment. There's some other programs in here, performance grants, etc. But to give you an idea, yes, I'm sorry?
Any word on the East High School being taken over by the U of R, and they revamped the whole school? Has the state had any feedback on how that's going?
Yeah, East High, which has been put into receivership because it was a school that had persistent failures. It has a brand new system. It's essentially taken away from the city school district, and the state of New York effectively runs it through this receivership program. And we're starting to see some much better, lower truancy rates. More kids are attending school. There's a long way to go, and it's only in the first few months, obviously.
I put my son in there on purpose when I heard the U of R took over.
Yes. Yeah, and the U of R is in partnership with the state.
Fantastic program.
Good. We're talking about doing more like that. So statewide universal pre-K is something that the governor has been really making a push for, as well as the city of New York, and we propose significant increases in spending. We're going to add another $340 million to allow school districts to be able to provide the program. Oddly enough, or ironically, not every school district has full-day kindergarten, so we're trying to make sure we correct that sort of odd situation where a child could go to pre-K as a 4-year-old all day and then go to a half-day kindergarten, which doesn't make any sense. So we're trying to identify those places where we still need to be able to come up with additional dollars for that. Community school funding, I mentioned, $100 million for community schools. Charter school grants, we provide $27 million in support of new per pupil funding. So what essentially happens if you have a charter school and it's approved by the state of New York, you get to take the state funding per child for the home district and send that to the charter school instead, and the governor has proposed a modest increase in that statewide. Special education, schools for the deaf and blind get $98 million from the governor in his proposal, a $2.3 million increase from last year's enacted budget, and these are schools that the state supports. They're special schools. Parental choice in Education Act. This is the controversial, last year was very controversial. This year it's less controversial, partly because of the way the governor's designed it this year. But it essentially allows a tax credit for people who would contribute to private schools and create a fund which would then pay tuition for children who can't afford to go to either Catholic schools or, if you're an Orthodox Jew, to go to a school that's a religious school. Also private schools like Harley or Allendale. This was very controversial. The governor proposed it last year, and it ultimately did not get approved by the legislature. The governor's proposed it again this year, although honestly, I think hasn't been nearly as vocal about it or as aggressive about it. So I have serious doubts of whether that will actually happen. The governor's also proposed, there's been a lot of controversy around student testing and evaluating teachers based on those tests. So this, again, extends the moratorium on linking those two things and provides some additional dollars for the state education department to create better forms for the standardized assessment tests. You know, I don't know where the future of this lies. There will still always be testing of some kind in schools, but there's been real controversy around state standardized tests and the linkages, as I said, to evaluating teachers. We do a number of things around early college or access to college, particularly for students who still need remediation, even though they get a high school diploma, and students who just aren't ready. And so we're trying to make that a little better for people, trying to make sure that you're appropriate when you go to a community college or a state university or even a private college. And so these programs have been proposed by the governor to the tune of $3 million. Career and technical education, this is, for years people said to us as we had converted to essentially Regents diplomas only, and you didn't have local diplomas as we had when many of us were in school. I know when I was at Eastridge, we had local diplomas which weren't Regents, but it was a high school diploma. That sort of went away. Everybody was then required to get a Regents exam. Well, for many students who might want to pursue a vocational education or career training instead of college preparation, the Regents diploma as it was constructed really wasn't appropriate. And so what we've done is we've expanded the ability for students who get a career and technical education. They still get a Regents diploma, but there's more vocational and career training. So you could go into the building trades, you become a carpenter, a bricklayer, etc. And the governor's proposed some additional dollars to eliminate barriers for students to be able to take that, particularly those who have disabilities or have English as a second language. Higher education, and I think I'll try to go a little faster through this. You have the brochure, so if you have questions on reading it, feel free to call us. But the State University of New York, we, as I said earlier, spend about $10 billion. The proposal is an increase of about $194 million. There are concerns from SUNY that may not be enough to meet their costs, but we're continuing to work with them. We did something called SUNY and CUNY 2020 that allows additional dollars for a number of things, some capital improvements on the campuses. It also allowed the campuses to increase tuition, typically about $300 a year over the last several years. The governor has proposed to continue that, although the legislature, and I think both the Senate and Assembly agree on this, that we would like ways of finding the dollars to be able to provide support for SUNY without a tuition increase this year, and maybe not next, but certainly this year. So that's something that has been talked about. Community base aid is the amount of money that we send to the community colleges, and it's based on the number of students that are enrolled as full-time equivalents. And the governor's proposed maintaining it at the same level, and the community colleges have an increase. It says $463 million to support base aid, and the community colleges are asking us for additional dollars. Originally, when community colleges were set up, they were supposed to be paid 1/3 by students through tuition, 1/3 through their host or local community, in this case Monroe County government, and 1/3 by the state of New York, and that has changed over time. Students now pay about 40% of the bill instead of 33%. So there's always a push to try to get them additional dollars so the state and local governments will be meeting their original commitment. SUNY Capital, there's a proposed increase in capital. At the level is about $528 million total in capital funding, and tuition assistance, which we help students who don't have resources to be able to pay for both private and public school. He's called for an increase of $20 million over last year. Health and mental hygiene, and I'll go through this relatively quickly. The budget proposes $75 million to continue support for distressed hospitals, additional support for a program that the governor would like to end the HIV/AIDS epidemic in New York. It's a 5-year program, $200 million commitment. That's a new expenditure. And in addition, $10 million for improved services and $30 million for dedicated housing opportunities. People may have heard that the governor has proposed an investment that would help women with screening for breast cancer and men for screening for prostate cancer. This is something that the governor's taken up, particularly in light of the fact that Sandra Lee, who is his longtime partner, had breast cancer last year, and it's created more sensitivity for the governor about awareness and early detection. OPWDD is the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, and this covers a wide range of people who have developmental delays or developmental disabilities. The governor's proposed a $30 million increase in the support of up to 6,000 new service slots for individuals with disabilities who are living at home or in residential school settings, and $3 million to support community-based services. He's proposed $10 million in capital investments for new housing. I'm sorry. Yes.
Keep finishing until, I have a question in reference to the mental hygiene. I have been an advocate for the mentally ill for many, many years, and I've had 2 members of my family. How much money is going into the mental health care? Because that's a preventative kind of way of helping people who are on the street, who do not understand mental illness. They are not the ones who are going out to it. I get so aggravated over this mental health issue that nothing is done. In fact, I'm angry at NAMI who don't fight as hard as far as the mental illness. That is a disease that should be addressed from the time children are born. That's why we have all these other problems. And no money goes into the mental health and that there's a lot of good mental health people here in the city of Rochester that I've worked with. They do wonderful stuff, but there's no money for mental illness.
Well, I wouldn't say there's no money. I'm sure that.
There is not enough.
Okay. And mental illness, I mean, when we talk generally about mental health, that includes developmental disabilities, people with mental illness, people with addiction issues, people on the autism spectrum. So there are significant numbers, and some of those, particularly children on the autism spectrum, the numbers are growing and growing in a significant way. So we can get you more detail on spending for the sort of narrow mental health programs. We have the Office of Mental Health in the state of New York, and we work with our county partners and obviously a lot of not-for-profit partners. But this is a familiar, as I said to a group yesterday, I think Billy Carpenter was at that meeting. I said, there's no region of the state and no service delivery group that ever says, yeah, you know what, we got enough money, don't worry about us, we're good. So this is part of the challenge of budget making, is trying to identify how to meet the needs of people who are in distress and have challenges, and also to invest money on the future. So school aid, for instance, is really our investment in the future in children. But we do, and we particularly spend a lot of money when it comes to special services and aid for special education in schools.
Totally different than mental illness, and do you remember Penny Cook?
Yes.
She advocated for the mentally ill. Everybody confuses mental illness with everything else. It is not. It's a separate and a.
Well, it is, but as I said, we sort of look, under the rubric of a whole host of things that deal with, and now behavioral health is a huge issue as well that people are identifying, and we have a shortage of even providers in that space. Just to continue, there's $10 million in capital investments to support new housing for people with developmental disabilities. The advocates would like a significant increase beyond that. Yes, sir.
Economically speaking, wouldn't adding dollars up front for taking care of the mental health, mental illness issue save you on the long-term cost of public services, criminal justice, courts, prison systems, hospitals, which cost a lot more in the long run? With a small initial investment on front, you will be saving multitude of dollars in the future.
Yes, and that's why we invest money in early intervention and other programs, although some mental illnesses don't manifest themselves until later in life. But I think that's true of most things, and that's certainly why we've invested more in early intervention, in special education, in K through 12. The earlier children on the autism spectrum, the more that we provide services early on, the longer term cost. But you can say that about a lot of things, frankly. I mean, we can do that if we could intervene with children in urban environments or in dysfunctional families and provide additional support. We would reduce incarceration. We would reduce long-term expenditures. So it's trying to find the dollars up front to do all that, because you can't ignore the fact that even if you would reduce the cost of prisons long-term, you still have to provide prisons now. So you have to address the needs that you have now as well as make investments in the future. So that's the balancing act, and that's what we try to do, and that's what effectively budgeting is. I'm going to start taking questions now, I guess. Yeah.
I work with people with developmental disabilities in the private sector.
Yes.
Volunteer agency. It seems like the state-run houses and programs get the bulk of the funding, where we're having to cut back every year. In fact, recently we got a grant in $100,000 that was in the
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't hear all that. I apologize. I actually have microphone. Why don't we do this? Let me just quickly go through the rest of this, and then we'll take all the questions, okay? And we'll come back to you for the first one. Obviously, there's a big increase in the number of heroin overdose, so there's a move by the legislature and governor to increase support for substance abuse treatment programs, particularly a focus on opioids. Human Services paid family leave is a push by the governor and the Assembly to provide paid family leave. It would be funded by employees, not employers, and it would, in a sense, mirror the Federal Family Leave Act with two exceptions. The Federal Family Leave Act, which is 12 months of protection for people on paid or on family leave, is unpaid, so you have to pay for it yourself, but it gives you protection in terms of job loss. But it mirrors the 12-week at the state level, and it applies to everyone. I think the federal law does not apply to businesses of fewer than 50 people, but the proposed state law would apply to all employers, and the legislature is talking about that. Some additional dollars for tuition or for temporary assistance for needy families, and there's a poverty initiative that we began and we've working on here in Rochester, which I'm pleased to be able to lead with the county executive and the mayor and a whole host of other really committed individuals. And the governor's now wants what we're doing replicated around the state. Quickly, I said there's going to be a significant increase in transportation spending. That's both mass transit and roads and bridges. The MTA, which is the transit system in the metro region of New York, gets as a significant capital need, as do we have around roads and bridges. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my friend Bill Carpenter, who heads the Rochester Regional Transit Service here, RTS and RGRTA. And we're trying to get additional upstate transit dollars. The governor's proposed some toll reductions for people in farming, as well as persistent users or people who are on the thruway often. This proposal has actually met with some resistance by the legislature, who thinks it's a one shot, and next year the tolls would have to go up anyway, and is there a better way to use some of those dollars? But that's what the governor has proposed to date. We have additional dollars for local highways. We have something called the Consolidated Highway Improvement Program, which is referred to as CHIPS, and Marcus Selly Program. Those are for local governments to provide for the local roads that are not state roads. We've got some dollars there. The governor's proposed an airport revitalization competition. The governor's big on competitions between regions. I'll put together a pot of money, and the various regions have to come up with the best plans that they can. I will say there's a lot of criticism about this. It's referred to as the Hunger Games in state government. But I will say this, the flip side is it really forces local communities to come together to identify really important projects and transformational needs. And the competition, in any competition, it sort of forces you to do your best. And I actually think at the regional economic development level, in any case, it's been a valuable tool in forcing community leaders to really focus on what the most important priorities are. I'll just mention the Environmental Protection Fund, a significant increase the governor's proposed in funding, a $123 million increase, proposed levels of $300 million this year. And those also include, there's a new sort of climate change mitigation account, and the governor's appropriated $32 million. He's proposed that. And there are other things that we use for
That could go to the mental health people.
Well, if you didn't care about climate change, I guess that's true. But there's a big environmental community that thinks that we need to work on solid waste programs. Included in this is parks and recreation remediation and efforts to create open space opportunities. A big move on water infrastructure. You can imagine after what's happened in Flint, Michigan, and Hoosick Falls here in New York, that people are concerned about the infrastructure of water. We're actually pretty blessed in our region because our water supply is protected at Hemlock Lake and why am I forgetting the other lake? Help me, somebody. Thank you, Candidates. Thank you. And through state law, we have limited development around those to make sure that we maintain quality water supply. And then there's a state Superfund program. Aid to municipalities is basically what you'd call revenue sharing. Years ago, it's unrestricted aid to local governments. There are concerns about the level of support for local governments, particularly with the property tax cap in place. So there's a big push by local cities and counties and towns to try to get additional dollars. The governor also is trying to push people to consolidate governments. Easier said than done. Most people don't want to give up their local government, and that's been something that hasn't been subscribed to as much as the governor would like. He talks about a lot of local governments. He'll sometimes say there are 10,000 local governments in New York. The truth is, many of those, are like sidewalk districts or lighting districts that don't have any they don't really have a cost because there's no people that work for them. He likes to say it's a sort of way of illustrating we have a lot of local governments, but probably nowhere near the number that the governor has proposed. But he's put dollars in to encourage at least shared services, which I think our governments here in Monroe County and upstate do a pretty good job of, but we're going to push them to do more. Yeah, that'll work. This is part of that consolidation program and a whole host of other citizen empowerment grants, which I'm not sure that I even fully understand. I'm not going to lie. Public safety, counterterrorism activities. He's proposing consolidating everything with the state police under anti-tourism unit and a New York State Intelligence Center. Disaster preparedness dollars he proposes to increase because of things like Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, I think it was Lee and Isaac that were storms that affected New York. So he wants to make sure that people are prepared to deal with those emergencies, particularly since they seem to be happening with natural disasters with much greater frequency. Justice system, one of the things that the governor's proposed is raising the age of people who can be tried as adults in New York. New York is only one of two states. I think I was going to say Nebraska might be the other one. What is it? North Carolina, thank you. The only two states in the country that try 16 and 17-year-olds as adults in criminal courts. So the governor's proposed changing that pretty dramatically. It's faced fairly stiff opposition from folks. It would probably be exceptions still for violent crimes. They would still, 16 and 17-year-olds will still be tried as adults for violent crimes, but for many others would be tried in the family court system instead of the criminal court system. We are still going to have prisons. I think people are still going to commit crimes. But this will take 16 and 17-year-olds out of it and put them into the family court system. And alternatives to incarceration, which is a significant thing. We try to redirect people, particularly people who have substance abuse issues, people who have other challenges, that it's more intelligent to try to divert them away and not put them in the prison system. And also to spend dollars on reentry. When people are coming out of prison, they need a way to transition back to daily life.
Great idea.
Well, we try. A couple of other opportunities. One is the minimum wage. The governor's proposed increasing the minimum wage in the state to $15 an hour. That would be both for upstate and the metro region, although on different time schedules. So 6 years to get to the minimum wage of $15 in upstate New York, and in 2018 in New York City. This is obviously and it would have a scheduled increase. Fast food workers under the wage board, which the governor has asked, have also already had a $15 an hour target approved. So this would put everyone else on par with fast food workers. A 5-year housing plan called House New York 2020, which would create affordable housing units and additional supportive housing units in the state of New York. There's some youth employment opportunity dollars, $31 million for summer youth employment programs and additional housing assistance. Ethics reform, I'll just talk briefly about. This is obviously something that legislators and the governor are working on and trying to come to some conclusion around, but there's varying opinions on what to do or if to do anything. These are some of the things the governor has proposed. And I won't spend a lot of time because some of it's complicated, but LLCs relate to treating LLCs as individuals or not when it comes to campaign contributions, some increased disclosure around campaign filings, limiting outside income for legislators. This one is obviously targeted to what happened to the former speaker who had outside income, so there's questions about this. This is really an issue for people, attorneys. We have some pharmacists. We have I think we have a veterinarian. We have a funeral director. People who are still working at their jobs while they serve in the legislature. And there's a big disagreement among legislators about whether or not we should limit that income or not. Public financing system, which is similar to the one that they use in New York City, has been proposed, which is essentially if a legislator raises $1 for his or her campaign, then it would quadruple, quintuple. In New York City, it goes up by a factor of 6, so the government gives you $5 for every dollar you raise, so you get $6 for every dollar you raise. Obviously, another controversial issue among the public anyway, as I've looked at some of the polling around it. Some transparency issues related to freedom of information requests, forfeiture of pensions for legislators and public officials who violate their public trust. That I'm almost certain will get done. JCOPE is the ethics board that has been created in the last few years, increasing what they do, because some questions about the way they actually have conducted themselves, and strengthening requirements for people who are registered as lobbyists or who are not registered as lobbyists. The governor's also proposed every 20 years under our current Constitution, the public will be asked whether we need to convene a constitutional convention in New York. The last time it was asked on the ballot, and be asked on the ballot again, was 1997, and voters pretty overwhelmingly defeated the idea of convening a constitutional convention. 19 years have gone by, so next year in 2017, the question will be on the ballot once again whether or not the public wants to call a constitutional convention for the purposes of either amending or completely redoing the New York State Constitution. So the governor's proposed a commission to start preparing questions and background material. Should there be a convention convened, it would be background and prep material.
Online, the New York State Constitution, is that online?
Yeah, sure. And it is several times longer than the United States Constitution. It is frankly not well written, and it's pretty unwieldy, but it has some important protections that people care about, and some of the fear has been that if a convention is convened, that those protections, for instance, we have in New York State a safety net. We're one of the few states that requires indigent people to be cared for. The whole tradition of public schools is written into our Constitution. So there are protections for public employees, working men and women who are in the construction field have unique protections in New York, and so people are concerned about a convention doing away with that. There's no limitation on a convention, if it's called, as to what the convention delegates can change or not change. So it'll be an interesting conversation. Allowing early voting in New York, that happens in many states in the Union. It does not happen in New York, but there's a proposal to begin to do that. And registration, when you get your license, an automatic registration. At that time, you get the forms, but this proposal would be an automatic. You'd be registered, unless I guess you could opt out, I guess, but otherwise you'd be automatically registered in the state. So that's sort of a general thing. It went longer than I would have liked. I apologize. I think we have microphones. And the microphones are helpful not only so that all of you can hear, but I can't hear very much, so this will help me as well. So we'll get to every question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'll be short here. I just